Alright, so today is another unscripted video where I'm just going to talk about my experience with my time traveling to Nepal and to a few different famous sites across that country in early 2024. So, to add some structure to it, I'm going to be going through my camera roll for that time and then just throwing some of these pictures up onto the B-roll for you to see as well. So just getting started, when I was traveling there, I flew out of New York because I spent some time with my girlfriend before I was heading out. I was in Nepal for 3 months and traveled to 4 different cities in total, but most of my time was spent between Chitwan National Park and Kathmandu. So flying in out of New York, flew straight from there to New Delhi. And one thing that was notable about that flight was that the flight path went right over Iran, so I got to see some of the natural features of Iran, such as the Alborz Mountains and Mount Damavand, which is a famous volcano there, which is pretty cool to be able to see that since it's not so easy to travel to Iran, or at least it's not recommended at this point in time. Moving on from that, the Delhi airport, I believe it's called the Indira Gandhi International Airport, is pretty nice. I got some good food there, and but I don't think that I had that long of a layover. It was a couple hours at most, and then we were in Kathmandu, which is another relatively short flight. I can put a map up. So at that point, I arrived at the, it's a sort of bed and breakfast place that I was staying at. I was traveling with one of my friends who actually was doing research there. So once we got to this place, it was, we got our rooms together and unpacked because it was, a big trip. I had a humongous bag. So I really just hung out for a bit and absorbed the time change because it was I believe 11 hour and 45 minute time change because the Nepal time zone is on a strange basis where it's not on an exact hour increment from other time zones. It's on a 45-minute one. So my bed and breakfast did have a really nice view from the top of it. It overlooked a famous square in Lalitpur. It wasn't in Kathmandu proper. There is essentially an old city in the south part of the Kathmandu metro area known as Lalitpur or Patan. And that area is where I was staying for any of the time that I was in Kathmandu, really. But I had a nice view of this square. I could see some nice religious shrines, mostly for Hinduism and Buddhism. In this particular area, they actually have an interesting combination of those faiths, where there is a sect of Hinduism where they recognize the Buddha as an incarnation of a Hindu god, and therefore kind of integrate the beliefs and practices of both religions, which was very interesting to see, and I did not know about that at all until I went there. So, moving on through my pictures on this first little bout through Kathmandu, I was actually staying there for, I think, a week or 10 days. Then I went to Chitwan. Then while I was at Chitwan, that's where I spent most of my time, about 2 months. I did take a 1-week trip from there to Lumbini, a 1-week trip from there to Pokhara, and then I came back to Kathmandu for the last about 2.5 weeks of the trip. So that's the structure of it. So moving on, yeah, Kathmandu is a really beautiful city, because it just has a lot of very detailed architecture, and they value their public spaces to a very large degree. Although sometimes the city can feel very tight and claustrophobic, there is a lot of public squares and areas where you can just kind of hang out, walk around, look at a nice historic temple. There's, I would say, hundreds, at least, individual temples within the city itself, and you can walk around and see them basically endlessly. The city architecture itself in Patan is also very nice. It's actually not quite as old as it looks. I believe most of these row house style buildings were actually built in the 20th century, but they incorporate pieces of architecture from earlier in time, such as some of this wood paneling is actually taken from older buildings and then put up on these newer ones, which is very interesting practice. So getting into the most famous area of Patan or Lalitpur is the Patan Durbar Square, which means Palace Square. So this is an area where the story goes, and I believe this is historical record, that there were 3 kings in the medieval times, in about the 14 to the 1600s, and they were somewhat related, somewhat like the princes of Russia during that same time period, and they would kind of try to outcompete each other with their small city-states and how they built their palaces and temples, and they tried to outdo each other. So there's 3 of these Durbar squares that are all now famous tourist sites and well-respected cultural sites as well because of the temples, spread around the Kathmandu Valley. One is here in Patan, the Patan Durbar Square, and then there is the Bhaktapur Durbar Square to the east of Kathmandu, and then there is the Kathmandu, or the Hanuman Doka Durbar Square, as it's called in Kathmandu proper, in the city center, I suppose. So this is the first one, Patan Durbar Square, and you can see some of the temples that are just truly unique and beautiful hand-carved architecture, the stone and wood, all from various time periods throughout 100 years or hundreds of years of time. So there's both these pagoda style and the more stupa style buildings. And if you notice, there is a bit of scaffolding around some of these buildings, and that is because there was a major earthquake in Nepal. I think it was in 2015, I'll fact check that, but it actually completely leveled a couple of these temples and severely damaged the rest. And the people in Kathmandu basically banded together and found artisans and people with traditional craft skills to piece them back together in a traditional manner. So it would maintain both its UNESCO World Heritage status, for one, and its cultural integrity as a holy site. So it's a very interesting process that is still ongoing and won't be fully completed for a few years, I believe. So in this square, what you've been seeing mostly are these temples, but the largest building in the square is the palace, the Durbar itself. And that is now a museum that the public can access. And so you can see both the interior design and architecture of this building to see what it would look like to walk through these hallways, but then they also have a variety of cultural exhibits that are scattered throughout the museum that you can see artifacts from across the country, really, that are hundreds to thousands of years old. This is the throne of the king that was in this particular palace. You can see the cobras, which was a motif of their family dynasty. And you can also look out the windows of the palace, which I enjoyed doing, to see what the view of the square would have been like for the royals of that time. There's also some very nice outdoor courtyards as well, where you can see these private or formerly private royal courtyards and these very peaceful areas that you can walk around in. The museum was never particularly crowded at any time that I was there, except for one, really. So the signature food in Nepal, or the signature street food, should I say, is this dumpling known as a momo. And this photo here shows a stand mixer that it's about 4 feet tall. I don't know why this picture is such bad quality, but This stand mixer was at this restaurant that we went to that basically made amazing momos, and it was only about $1 for a plate of 12. So the street food and the food in general was very wonderful, and you'll see more of that as we go along. I took some photos of the vehicles in Nepal just because they're all either different brands or different models than the ones we see in the US, so I found it kind of interesting. There was also a lot of stray cats and stray dogs and stuff that I took a lot of pictures of on this trip. Probably over 100 photos of stray animals, but that's just how it goes. They're very cute. Here's a photo of the money that they use, which is really one of the best sets of currency that I've ever seen, because every bill has a different native animal on it. So you have snow leopard, deer, which is, I believe, the chital deer, and then you have the elephant, the tiger, and the rhinoceros. So really nice looking art on their currency. This is what the shower looked like at the bed and breakfast, and you can see that box on the wall. That is a kerosene or propane heater that would have a live flame inside of it, and that pipe is actually gas. So seeing a live flame in your shower that's heating up the water is a little bit unnerving at first, but it really does a good job of getting the water hot very quickly, so you get used to it. So the second cultural site that I went to, and this is also included in the UNESCO World Heritage Sites of the area, and that is Pashupati Temple, or Pashupatinath Temple. And this is one of the most famous and revered Hindu temples in the world. It's one where there is a central temple area where there is worship actively going on, and non-Hindus are not necessarily welcome in there. I didn't go in there, but I was just walking around the outside of the temple complex, because there's hundreds of different buildings, and tourists are very welcome to come and see it and enjoy the atmosphere. It also sits on a hill that overlooks the city, which is quite wonderful. So going through here, you might notice some smoke in the background of some of these photos, and that's because there are actually cremations taking place on the river here. This is the Bagmati River, which is a holy river in Hinduism, and therefore people, when they pass away, are cremated in this river. So I didn't really get up close to these cremations because, I didn't want to intrude on what they're doing there, because there's people mourning and, having emotional expressions. I didn't want to be that tourist that's walking right up and taking a picture of the person. So I would advise that you don't really do that either. So just saying. So moving on, you can see some of the variety of architecture, because a lot of these different buildings were built throughout a multi-century period. The earliest, I believe, about 1,000 years ago. There's also a abundance of rhesus macaque monkeys, and they just kind of inhabit this temple and walk around because, nobody's going to harm them in a holy place, essentially. Whereas in the city, they're probably going to get run over by cars and driven out of people's shops and so on. So they congregate in this area, and they just kind of hang out. If you don't bother them, they don't bother you. But they are kind of defensive of their young, so don't get too close to these guys. Don't touch them, definitely. They have certain diseases and things. There's also a handful of cows. You probably know that cows, domesticated cows, are considered sacred animals in Hinduism. And so they are just walking through this area, hanging out, having a good time. So the third holy site and cultural site that I went to is known as the Boudha Stupa, or the Boudhanath. And this is a more Buddhist holy site, specifically for Tibetan Buddhists. And you see a lot of Tibetan script as you walk around this area, but the central stupa is, I believe, over 100 feet tall. It's very massive. And one of the most interesting things I found was that the entire neighborhood around it is shaped like a circle to accommodate this huge stupa, because this was actually the first thing that was there in the area, because it was built in, I believe, 500 AD, and then it's just been gradually maintained, restored, repainted, and things like that throughout the years. And you can walk around it, and really there's a lot of gift shops and a lot of art shops and things like that if you want some Buddhist art, although it's not necessarily cheap, because it is oriented towards tourists to some extent, even though many locals do see it as a holy site and hang out there, as well as just a pleasant area to be in the city. I also took a couple of Nepali lessons while I was there, just to pick up basic conversational things, numbers, how to say hello, and things like that. So that was pretty much the end of my first week in Kathmandu. So after that, to travel to Chitwan, I took a bus, and I believe this was just a public bus. I don't think that it was a coach bus. So that was an interesting experience, because the roads are pretty much completely dirt, and the route is only about 70 miles, but it takes over 8 hours to get there, because it's not only wall-to-wall traffic the entire way with buses, heavy machinery, cars, motorcycles, mopeds, etc., but also it is complete switchbacks. It is completely switchbacks the entire way, because you're coming out of Kathmandu, which is in the foothills of the Himalayan mountains, and you're going into Chitwan, which is at sea level. So that is pretty interesting. The geography of Nepal is very hard to understand for especially people in the US, because it's a country that's about the size of Tennessee, and the shape of that, because it's long, and it has about the population of Texas. So it has a very dense population. Then, at the north end of the country, you have the Himalayan mountain range, including Mount Everest, the highest point on Earth. And at the south end of the country, you have the Terai lowlands, which are literally at sea level. So it's quite an insane gradient of altitude, let alone climate. So taking that drive was fascinating, and I was looking out the window the entire time. But as I arrived in Chitwan, I saw the lowlands and the rolling hills and the fact that it's a pretty rural village, and thought to myself, this is going to be pretty laid back and chill. But in reality, that's right where things started getting most interesting, because the next day I got a job as a wildlife veterinary intern. So stay tuned for the second part of this video, where I go through that process. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.